Hi, Leah.
Hi.
I'm glad you came.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming to our new studio. Wow, you're the first one.
This is exciting.
Yeah.
It's very fun.
Yeah, good. I was going to say, or start this with one name,
Okay.
which is Gita Swamidas.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Gita, yes.
You know her personally.
So we've talked on the phone. I haven't met her in person. But yeah, I found out about her through this Charlotte Lozier Institute report. So the Charlotte Lozier Institute is it's kind of like the research arm of SBA Pro-Life America, which is one of the top pro-life organizations in the country. And I saw her name because she was the first director of a medical pregnancy center that offers ultrasounds.
Yeah, you mentioned that in your book, which I thought was an interesting point. And the reason I wanted to start with that is because she was the midwife for our first child.
No way.
Yeah.
Are you serious? Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so, I'm going through your and Marvin's book, and I'm getting through Marvin's historical, what would you say, what year would you say Marvin's covering?
So 1652 until 1995, roughly.
Right, so he's covering this quite expansive period of time.
Yeah.
And it's like, all right, now it's time for Leah's chapters. And the first words are Gita Swamidas.
Wow.
I literally stopped my eyes. I just thought, all these memories are swarming back of our interactions with her and her being in our home during what was actually quite a difficult pregnancy. We ended up having to go to the hospital. It worked out fine, but she's amazing.
Yeah.
And I didn't know the story that you told about her. I mean, your first chapter opens up with this pretty gruesome, tragic story of her being this young, naive doctor.
Yeah.
What was she, straight out of med school, right?
Yeah. And she witnessed an abortion. She didn't know it was going to be an abortion. But yeah, I remember her telling me just like, oh, I was so excited to go watch this surgery. And she gets there and this baby comes out and dies on the medical tray. And yeah, crazy. Yeah, it was an abortion. And from our conversation, it was really that moment that was very influential in what she decided to do in the coming years. So, yeah.
So the reason I wanted to bring that up was, of course, it's a very interesting story and an important connection that I have with the book, but also it's her telling her story. Mm-hmm. And your book, I'm going to say your book, even though for those listening, it's also Marvin Alaski, but let's just say for your book, it's not a history of abortion. Mm-hmm. It's the story of abortion. I mean, I guess you could call it the stories.
Yes.
And, why did you and Marvin decide to write it from that standpoint?
Yeah, and that's actually a part of the subtitle, the street level history part. But we didn't want to just talk about the legal side of abortion, the politics. We wanted to tell the stories of like the individual people who are affected by this issue, and also recognizing that it's popular opinion and the opinions of everyday people that affects the legislation and the politics. So we wanted to tell it from that perspective, but also because Marvin, I can't remember if he talks about this in the intro or if he and I have just talked about this one-on-one, but I think he does talk about it in the intro. But he talks about how pro-choice, the concept of pro-choice is that itself is not a street level view of the issue. That's a sweet level. That's the other term he uses to contrast with street level. It's sweet level. It's at the level of ideas and just language working around the reality and the facts. So specifically with the word pro-choice, what you're losing there is what's actually happening and the person that's dying in an abortion. So that was another thing. This is a way to bring the child, the aborted child, into the story. When you get past the politics and get down into the individual stories, like Gita's story, you see that child dying. We also see the bodies of aborted babies in this book, rattling bones in a little cigar box of aborted babies. So getting down to those stories kind of exposes the reality. So
it's intense.
Yes.
This morning I was reading through your chapters again, and yeah, you have babies in refrigerators and shallow graves. Pretty horrific. But also you talked about how a lot of that stuff is just hidden or ignored for various reasons. But I wanted to ask you, as someone who yourself is a reporter, and this is what you do, right? So, but what drew you to this topic of abortion? You could have been reporting on other things.
Sure.
Why abortion?
Well, the honest story is what drew me, Marvin, Olasky, and God. When I was interning for World before they hired me full time. So I guess there was one conversation. Marvin, there were two of us interns, and we actually lived in the Olasky's basement as we were interning for them, and we'd have dinner together sometimes. And one day Marvin asked, I think the question was, what issue do you think you could get more interested in or engaged in? And I think it was like LGBTQ, like gender sexuality issues, or abortion. And I said, I think abortion. I feel like that really tugs on my heartstrings. Obviously, I have a biblical perspective on marriage and sexuality, but when it comes to abortion, it's more emotional for me. I love kids. I love babies. So I said that. And throughout the summer, as I was interning, he would give me stories to work on that were related to abortion. And then when they hired me full time, it was Marvin that actually gave me the job offer. And he was like, I want to hire you to write about abortion. And I want you to help me with this book.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Off the bat, like,
yes.
And when was that?
That was 2019.
Recently.
Yeah.
And did you have any idea that this monumental reversal
of
Roe, for those listening, was on the horizon?
No.
So you chose what?
Yeah. Well, and even when we found out that the Supreme Court was going to take up Dobbs, Marvin and I think we both fall on more of the pessimistic side of things. I mean, we love life and we love the world and we love our families, but especially with this issue, we were kind of like, yeah, it'll probably not lead to an overturn of Roe v. Wade. Some people were talking about that, but we weren't convinced. So even when we found out Dobbs was heading up to the Supreme Court, we thought, well, we'll just give an overview of the ruling. They'll probably uphold the 15-week abortion ban from Mississippi, and then here we are. So it's definitely not expected.
It's incredible because the last chapter of your book, right before the epilogue, you were detailing in broad brush, because you have to, what happened. And it was, pretty fascinating. I'd say for myself too, I never would have expected that to happen. Now we know that's not an overturning of abortion in the U.S. Yeah. Unfortunately. But it's a step. And we'll see what happens with that. Are you excited about, we'll get more into the book in a minute, but are you excited about, I wanted to ask the what's next question later, but are you excited about what the future might hold for you and your career as a reporter on abortion because of the new direction of the kind of, what would we call it, the cultural dialogue around abortion, and what may be on the horizon in terms of legislation and so forth?
Yeah, I think I'm excited in the sense of who knows what's going to happen. I think as soon as the Dobbs decision came out, I had this sense of like, okay, we're at the edge of a cliff, you know, and we don't know what's down there. Not that it was a bad thing, but at the same time, I didn't know. It's like, okay, this is a whole new ball game, new rules, and we're going to be figuring this out. It was kind of exciting though, because for the first couple years on this issue, I was having to catch up on what had happened. But now I feel like I'm just able to go along with, okay, this is new. This is what's happening now. And that's been really exciting to just see this new reality. Sometimes it's upsetting. There are certain things that you're like, I can't believe that we're dealing with this now. Like, for instance, just people being so angry about the overturn of Roe. And I touch on that a little bit in that last chapter, but
yeah, some of the violence and hostility, and amongst rival groups of protesters.
Yeah.
It's an interesting time in our country's history, for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
Let's talk about another character in the book. I'm sure there were stories you had to exclude.
Yeah.
And it's a large volume, but it reads, both yours and Marvin's sections read like very interesting newspaper articles.
That's good.
And I love that. I love that. It's not a boring history of this happened and then that happened and whatnot throughout the whole story of abortion. But it's this specific named person and this other specific named person had this. It's episodic.
Yeah.
It should be produced as a TV show.
That would be so interesting.
Yeah.
That would be interesting.
We'll talk about that later.
Okay.
So, but that made it very interesting to read. But you definitely pulled and highlighted stories that you thought would be not the most interesting necessarily, but the real movers within. I mean, Gita, right, as you said, she, correct me if I'm wrong, that had the first ultrasound clinic?
Yeah, pregnancy center specifically, yeah.
Okay. And then the very next chapter, which also surprised me, is, because I wasn't expecting it, is John Piper's name.
Yes.
And so tell me, why is John Piper significant as one of the stories of abortion?
Yeah, so he had a very specific story of how he started to recognize the importance of kind of speaking out on the abortion issue as a pastor. And pastors play a big role in this book. So we talk about other pastors earlier on in the book, and that's because one of the kind of channels that we're following the abortion issue through in the book is the question of, what does the Bible say about abortion? So there are some pastors, actually in my chapters, I talk about pastors who are clergy advisory pastors for Planned Parenthood. So there are some pastors who, or even just Christians who, they claim to be Christians, but yet they're supporting abortion because they believe in free will or a person's autonomy. And Pastor John Piper, on the other hand, looked to the scriptures and saw the value that scripture gave to unborn life. And because of that, it really led him into participating in sit-ins outside of abortion facilities and also preaching on abortion. So that's a topic that a lot of pastors don't want to touch. Even pastors who think abortion is wrong, it is controversial. They're afraid of hurting people in their congregation who have had abortions or just offending people, but it's still an important issue.
So even today, you think that's still a problem?
Yeah, I would say so, definitely.
Because you mentioned pastors, and sadly, some of the early stories that Marvin details are infidelitous pastors.
Yes.
They would take advantage of these young women and will just be gone.
Yeah. And actually, one of those cases was kind of a driving force behind a pro-life law in a state that specifically targeted abortion. Because before that, it was largely, they would people who forced abortions on women or performed abortions would often go on trial for murder. But since there was often not enough evidence to convince the whole jury, like all of the jury members, that this was a murder case, then these people that were guilty in the eyes of so many in the community would get off without any real punishment. So it was a case like that where a pastor kind of got off without getting what he really deserved, that then a state passed this pro-life law specifically outlawing, any attempt to abort an unborn child. So yeah, it is interesting how pastors have played both positive and negative roles in this issue.
Yeah, that. I think what really struck me, talking about these laws that were passed back in the earlier part of our history, is that, this is my ignorance, but I had thought of abortion as more of a contemporary issue.
Sure. Yeah.
Thought of abortion pre, let's say, World War II or World War I.
Sure.
Which is about the extent that my thinking can go backwards, is the classic image in your mind of like hangers.
Oh, sure.
Very crude, kind of brutalistic images of what an abortion was. But then before that, let's say 1800s, it just didn't even occur to me that there even was something, that abortions were even done or practiced very up.
Mm-hmm.
I just hadn't thought about it. It's not that I was like, no, of course they didn't have it. But actually, our nation has a very long history of killing the unborn. And that was quite sad for me to think of. But also, let's bring it back around to the involvement of clergy, is that I had assumed that it was just taken for granted that this is life and God has given it, and therefore we preserve it. But I think, Marvin, and then you also touched on it a bit in your chapters, but this concept of quickening, can you explain that a bit and how that has influenced the discussion of abortion since even like the early days of America?
Yeah. Well, so the argument in like Roe v. Wade, the opinion in 1973, the argument was that abortion is actually a part of our history and tradition and acceptable in early America up until the point of quickening, which is about 5 months. And that's when the mother can feel the baby kind of moving inside of her at that point.
So quickening, sorry to interrupt, quickening then is a perception from the mother.
Exactly.
Okay. Versus because then I think of quickening as coming to life or conception.
Yeah, they meant it more in the sense of like when the mom can feel that baby moving. Because the baby's moving before that, but maybe is small enough that the mother can't feel the baby. But around 5 months is when she can start feeling that. So that's the argument of a lot of pro-abortion groups today, was that, well, in early America, it was acceptable up until about 5 months. But we actually see, and in the early chapters, Marvin talks about these cases, specifically one of a man who forced an abortion on this woman, his wife. She used to be a servant, and then he married her, and but then forced an abortion on her when she was pregnant. And a midwife actually sees the aftermath, and she testifies in court that this baby was around 3 months, which is before quickening. And the man went on trial for murder. So that is one case that they did not consider in Roe v. Wade when they were asserting that it was acceptable up until quickening. So we wanted to expose stories like that, just so show that, this actually wasn't how early America, how people here saw abortion early on. And that's largely, they didn't have a great understanding of the science of unborn life or of development of babies in the womb, but they knew what scripture had to say, and that was a big influence in their view on how they saw abortion as wrong and as murder specifically.
Specifically as murder.
Yeah.
Let's let's shift gears a bit, because I want to get back to what I think is probably one of the most important aspects of this whole, I guess you'd call it a debate or an issue. Okay, so so my question really is about the role of media in this whole issue of abortion.
Yeah.
On both sides.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, so in my chapters, I talk about this one group who puts out these annual reports on like TV and movie depictions of abortion. And they actually say in some of those reports, like, hey, on the issue of gay marriage and transgenderism, depicting those positively in movies and TV really changed how people viewed this issue. And they say, we can do that with abortion. So Planned Parenthood actually has this staff member who is supposed to be somewhat of a Hollywood liaison, making relationships with directors and actors, trying to encourage them to depict abortion in a certain way. So she'll advise them on, a Planned Parenthood worker wouldn't say a curse word, or usually they have nice pictures on the walls in the surgical rooms, stuff like this. So obviously the pro-abortion industry does really want to affect what everyday people think about the issue, and they're using the realm of like TV and movies to make that happen. So I think we definitely can see how just what people are taking in, what they're reading in books, what they're seeing on television does affect that popular opinion and the personal opinions of just everyday people. And like I said earlier, that's what leads to certain laws being changed, and it's the people that affect those changes in a lot of ways. So, yeah.
So there's a huge impact that, stories have, and it's unfortunate that there's such a dominance of, now we can go the media over that ideological narrative. Yeah. So there's power in stories. Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, I think it was just at certain points your research in here is very good. You talk about how at different points in even recent history, polls have changed quite dramatically. Yeah. And some of that can be tied back to, what's been going on in the media? How many TV shows have been being produced with a pro-abortion stance or whatever it is? Fascinating. Okay.
Marvin talks about some books even that depict pro-life people in very negative ways. Like I think in the 90s, 80s, they're just depictions of these just crazed pro-life people who are standing outside of abortion facilities and just kind of bloodthirsty, which that's not ultimately what the pro-life movement is about, but that's how it was being depicted in these popular novels. I don't know how popular the novels were, but the authors at least were pretty well-known authors. And so that was probably affecting how different people were seeing the pro-life movement. And in the 90s, you see a real crash in popular opinion on the pro-life issue. Just more people than ever were calling themselves pro-choice at that time. And so Marvin kind of ties that back to, okay, this is what's going on in books, and maybe this is having an effect, this image that people are getting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting too in Marvin's chapters how the press at certain times in our country's history seemed to be quite interested in at least the sensational aspects of these high-profile instances of infant murder, or especially when the mother would die, right? That seemed to be more often the case.
Yeah, like if there's a beautiful woman that's dead, like that.
Yes, that's right.
That gets in the headlines.
That's right.
Faster than this baby, you know.
Yeah, because there's a full narrative. But what was it? There's that woman who was found floating down the river.
Yeah, and like women, there's a woman found in a trunk on a train, just her body stuffed in there. You know, just all these sensational stories. But it's rare to find a sensational story about a bunch of dead babies.
Well, let's talk about the dead mother problem. And I think it's in the earlier histories. Let's say, okay, so Marvin's chapters, oftentimes it's a woman dies. But if you track back a little bit in her story, what got her to that point? And here's where I want to not push back on what you and Marvin are doing, but I want to raise a few questions.
Sure.
So, a woman has died. Tragic, horrible. A baby obviously has died too. But let's focus on the woman for a minute, because I know that is the focus of the debate, and especially for the pro-choice side of things. In fact, as you talked about in the last chapter, I believe, in the dissenting opinion in the Supreme Court, there wasn't even a mention of fratricide. Am I getting that right?
Or infanticide?
Sorry, yeah. Of course there was no mention of fratricide.
I was like...
Or infanticide.
Yeah. Or just the question even of, is that baby alive? Right. They totally avoided that question.
It was completely about autonomy, the right to autonomy, complete autonomy of the woman to live the life that she wants to live and have access to whatever rights and whatever not. So, but reading Marvin's chapters was quite, it was quite profound, because it made me realize that, okay, we can't, when it comes to sin, we can't say, oh, the women were sinless and the men that took advantage of them are the perpetrators of all these crimes. The women have a part to play as well. And yet, isn't it true that, especially in, I would say, Marvin's history of the early history of America, before we've had things like the feminist movement and more of a kind of a taking of ground on the part of this whole equality fight, wherever, that's a whole other discussion. But at least in kind of historical, traditional America, what recourse would a woman have? I mean, a lot of times in these stories, they were manipulated, they were taken advantage of, and the shame, especially in the smaller communities that would come along with that. What could a woman do?
Yeah, well, it's interesting you mentioned like communities. So early on, Marvin talks about how that community around a woman in early America usually was family, like people close to her. And they actually encouraged, in those cases where like a woman would get pregnant outside of marriage, there's a reason it's called a shotgun wedding, The dad would have his gun, and sometimes. But if a woman got pregnant outside of marriage, the first kind of recourse for that couple was you get married. So there are actually many cases. Marvin has a specific number in one of his chapters, but I think it was like over 90 cases of either a man being named as the child support for that child, and only one abortion in a few decades in a certain community. Either that, or it was a certain number of marriages where the baby is born. Obviously, the baby was conceived outside of marriage, but the family is married. So you have these things around the couple. So the community pressure to marry, or also the community pressure for the husband, or not the husband, but the father, to at least pay child support. That is a big part of those communities. So they had ways to make sure that woman and that child aren't left to figure things out on their own. It was that accountability when you have those close relationships of family and friends around you. But as people in early America started moving to cities and young people taking jobs at factories in cities, you had less of that accountability. And that's where you see those abortions starting to happen more.
Yeah, Robin talks quite a bit about that.
Yeah.
The effects of urbanization, industrialization.
Yeah. Well, and so that's why you see in cities, even early on, like in the 1800s and the 1900s, there are Christian people who decide, well, I'm going to open a maternity home to help women, or I'm going to start this organization for men to give them something to do on the weekends without going out and being promiscuous. Just these organizations coming around and trying to be that community for those people involved in unplanned pregnancies. So,
okay, but what about today? Like, it's not like we can reverse history and go back to smaller in the past, where there's more of an honor-shame element that keeps a lot of things in check, not just unplanned pregnancies. What do you do? How do we do it now? Especially with the proliferation of technology that's bringing about all other kinds of changes as well, not just the effects of us living in cities with basically not even knowing the person that lives in the apartment next to you. So meaning you can do whatever you want to and no one's going to know.
Yeah.
What kind of solutions are there? Can there be enough pregnancy centers, or like the woman you talked about who has 15, 20 cottages on her ranch? Or she's able to house pregnant women?
I don't think those have been built yet, but that's her plan.
Oh, that's a work in progress.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, to those of our listeners who may have the resources, that would be very interesting to see more maternity ranches.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, that's a good example, things like that. But it is interesting in talking with some of these groups, like pregnancy center organizations. A lot of times they don't actually give the actual resource that the woman needs, but they'll refer her to a resource that's already in her community that she didn't know about. I think so often it's a knowledge issue. Just what are the women aware of? Sometimes the first thing that comes to their mind is just, well, I need to get an abortion. And they might not know, well, there's actually this program that will help you, get your food. There are pregnancy centers where you can get your stroller and your other needs for your baby. You can get diapers there. So I think it is kind of what's before their eyes the most, and often that's abortion. But if it becomes more of there are other things you can do that would allow you to parent this child, I think if they knew that, maybe that would happen more. But it's interesting because there are lots of pro-lifers who will go outside of abortion facilities who are telling women, hey, I will adopt your baby, or hey, we can help you. So I'm sure there are plenty of abortion facilities that don't have people going out of the buildings to say things like this. But women often are hearing this. The question is, though, do they believe that these people are going to help them? What's going on in their heart? So I think a lot of it is a heart issue, just thinking, well, they're saying that, but they won't actually do that. They won't actually help. But there are a lot of resources that, like I said, they might not know about or they might not be open to. So I think the solution is, making more of those resources available, but also a heart problem of, thinking about as a person who's facing an unplanned pregnancy, as a man who maybe caused that unplanned pregnancy or contributed, they should be thinking about not just themselves, but thinking about the third person, the baby, and looking around them at the people who want to help in those situations rather than having hard hearts. So it's like a two-way street. It's not just the givers that need to give more, but it's also the recipients that need to be open to receive what's being offered.
Yeah, it would be great to hear more stories about people who actually did, let's say, walked up to a stranger going into a pregnancy or an abortion clinic saying, I'll take your baby. Just have it and I'll adopt your child.
And I'm
like,
sure that's happened. Yeah.
I'm sure it has,
Yeah.
but maybe you need to report.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because those would be very
Yeah.
powerful testimonies.
For sure.
Because I haven't heard a single, I mean, you're telling me about it, and I'm sure it happens, but those would be powerful testimonies of rescue.
Mm-hmm. And actually more of a personal anecdote that obviously didn't make it into this book because it's just a recent story. But someone at my church, I actually first met him outside of an abortion facility. He was involved with this group that goes outside of our local abortion facility here in Grand Rapids and does that, like says, we'll adopt your baby, or we'll help you, we'll throw you a baby shower. And this one woman took one of his friends up on this. So they're throwing her a baby shower within the next few weeks. And so he was like texting the group at church, hey, can you like buy some stuff from this registry? We're throwing a baby shower for this mom who chose life. So there are there are personal connections here that show sometimes that happens, but it's for sure not the norm for someone who's actually walking into an abortion facility who has like made that commitment of I'm going here. So it takes a lot of courage for the woman who chooses not to, and a very soft heart too, to be willing to take someone up on that incredible offer and trust the Lord with the future. So,
yeah, and the fact that it's happening on such a scale that it is, it really seems like it would have to be a work of the Lord. And I say that because, well, just pulling one statistic out of your book that I can remember off the top of my head is, this great chapter you have on, I'm probably saying it wrong, but mifepristone.
Oh, that's right. Yeah,
okay.
Right. Took me a while, but you got it.
Mifepristone, or an abortion pill, which is different than the morning after pill, right? Yeah. Okay. Well, first give us a brief kind of understanding of what mifepristone is and does.
Yeah. So the another name for mifepristone is RU-486. That is,
which I think most people are familiar.
Yeah, they probably are more familiar with that name. Yeah. So that is the first of two drugs used in an abortion pill regimen. So you hear the word abortion pill, but it's actually multiple pills and two different drugs that are involved. Usually, if you do an off-brand version, there are different drugs or different dosages. But for this, mifepristone is the first, and a woman, when she takes that, it cuts off progesterone, basically the hormone progesterone, essentially starving the baby in a sense. And then the next drug that they would take within, I think, 24 or 48 hours, it's called misoprostol, and that one causes contractions to expel the baby. Some people, since mifepristone is so regulated compared to the second drug, sometimes people will just take the second drug in an off-brand sort of abortion. They're easier to access, but this is the FDA approved regimen for a chemical abortion, the mifepristone and the misoprostol together.
So, sorry to interrupt. So you could potentially only take the second and have a live-born baby.
I think the idea is that it would probably die in the process, but yeah, I assume that has happened. I'm sure that's happened, which is sad. But yeah, so the two together are supposed to be more effective in a negative sense in my mind, but yeah.
And well, this is going further down this rabbit trail. But what I didn't realize is that now there are reversal protocols for this.
Yeah, and that is only effective before you've taken the second drug. After you've taken the mifepristone, since the basic function of that drug is to cut off progesterone, you would then, if you want to reverse the effects or halt the effects of the mifepristone, you would take progesterone pills or injections, and that would try to kind of counteract what's already happening, to allow the baby to continue to stay inside of its mother and continue to develop. So, and from my understanding, based on what I'm seeing from these groups that provide abortion pill reversal, it's obviously not a guarantee that it'll work, but I think it's around 65%. It's 65% effective, but more effective the sooner you can start the treatment after you've taken that first drug.
So this gets us right into the issue of choice, because obviously the women that are choosing to get an abortion and haven't gone to the second pill yet, on the mifepristone. So they're taking the mifepristone. They have, 24 to 48 hours? Yeah. And then suddenly their choice changes.
Yeah.
What's going on?
Yeah. Well, I think some people, there's actually a story in one of my chapters about Hannah, this young woman who, she did feel really pressured into scheduling her abortion appointment in the first place, where she picked up the pills and took the first mifepristone doses. And she just didn't feel right about it. She went back and just cried and couldn't sleep. And the next morning was like, you know what, I can't do this. So she had heard about abortion pill reversal. She had also heard that it could cause hemorrhage, you could die, which is kind of the narrative from pro-abortion groups. But she contacted a pregnancy center that she had been in touch with before, and just hearing them just say, we can help you get this treatment to stop the effects of the pill, she said that just made her feel like, okay, I'm going to do this, So she did it. She actually talked with me, I think it was within just a week or two of actually taking the first doses of progesterone. So at that point, it's still not utterly clear if the baby's going to make it, but she was willing to speak with me, which is very uncommon. Normally, women who have gone through an abortion experience won't talk about it for years. Obviously, her baby didn't actually die, but even though at the time it wasn't a for sure thing that her baby was going to make it, she still told me about her story. She allowed me to use her full name. That was just incredible to me. And then I kept in touch with her and contacted her every once in a while in the coming months, just being like, hey, how's it going? Because you're like, okay, what's going to happen? Because with such a serious drug so early on in pregnancy, it's like, okay, we can't just expect that this is going to all go really well. It's only a 68 or 65% success rate, but she gave birth to a healthy baby girl. So
that's powerful.
Mm-hmm.
But these other women, the ones who have recently gone through with an abortion, you had a hard time getting them to speak.
Yeah.
Let me ask you another question that comes
sure.
that.
Yeah.
Is how do you go about finding women?
Yeah. Well, and that's probably part of the reason why they can be hard to get in touch with.
Like, how do you know who's done it?
Yeah.
Who would be willing to talk?
Sure. Yeah. So a lot of times I am getting in touch with, so I got in touch with Hannah through a pregnancy center. So she was the one that went to this pregnancy center, got their help, and was willing through the pregnancy center to speak with me. So sometimes pregnancy centers are in touch with women who regret their abortion, who are in a counseling program to kind of recover. So I think it would tend to be a woman who's really down on her decision to get an abortion that I would connect with through a pregnancy center, or someone who has decided not to get an abortion, which they would maybe be more likely to talk with me. But also sometimes that doesn't even happen because they're still pregnant. They're still dealing with this difficult new reality. Maybe people in their life aren't happy that they've chosen to give birth. But people who are really proud of their abortion, who think it's a fine thing, I think generally just wouldn't speak with someone from a Christian organization, which is unfortunate. But then in talking with women who have started pro-life organizations who have had abortions in the past, they are also the ones that have told me, oh yeah, I would never have talked about this until just a couple years ago. Like, it's been decades or years, and I'm just now starting to talk about it because of all the, just how emotionally fraught it is. You feel a lot of guilt. But yeah, so I think that is part of it is just because they're not necessarily happy about their decision, so they wouldn't want to talk about it until they've, a lot of times until they've come to know the Lord, become a Christian, confessed to the Lord their sins and accepted Christ's sacrifice on their behalf. That's when they're more likely to talk about it. So, yeah.
So did that make, that really made the work somewhat challenging for you, I could imagine. But on that point of finding people to talk to, can you tell us maybe one or two stories that didn't make it into the book that you wish had?
Oh. Man, it would take me a while to think of which ones.
There's a lot.
Well, there's one that I had included in an earlier draft about a woman who had taken, it wasn't clear what sort of abortion pill it was. It was really early on, like in the early 2000s, I think, maybe even in the late 90s.
So this was pre-mifepristone?
Yeah, I think so. And that was the thing. It seemed like, I think it must have been the late 90s because mifepristone was approved in 2000. And it wasn't clear to me how she would have gotten this drug. Yeah, it just wasn't clear to me. So anyway, so that's why we left it out, because there were certain questions about it that it was like, oh, well, how do we explain that? It seems like we can't really verify certain details. Not that I distrusted her story, but we wanted to present something that was convincing to even someone who might be skeptical. But she took this abortive drug, and then the baby didn't actually come out for weeks after she took the drug. She's like in high school, I think. And she just had this cool story of how it was her boyfriend, I think, and one other friend who brought her to get the drug. And then her boyfriend broke up with her. But then years later, he reached out to her and was like, hey, I know what I did to you back then, and I've become a Christian since then. And I just want to say I'm so sorry for, putting you in that situation and pressuring you or, encouraging you to get this abortion. And I think at that point she had also become a Christian. They ended up getting married. So that was one of those stories where it was, she obviously went through a really traumatic experience of, first of all, even getting an abortion, but also just how it went. It was so drawn out. She thought she was done, and then finally, like weeks later, she started having these side effects of it. But then the reconciliation, I think, was really powerful. So yeah, that's one story that almost made it in, but didn't make the cut. So yeah.
No, I'm curious, and I can imagine that as your career continues on, especially with what just happened with the Dobbs decision, that hopefully as public sentiment starts to change a bit, and if the polling is correct, that abortion becomes less and less appealing in people's eyes or acceptable, that you may start getting a lot more stories.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, and another thing, this is more anecdotal. I don't know if I have any evidence to back this up, but people at pro-life groups that do, say, post-abortion recovery counseling or Bible studies, they have said that they've noticed seeing more and more girls come in pretty quickly after the abortion to get this post-abortion counseling or a Bible study because they did a chemical abortion. So doing this abortion at home, where you take the drugs at home, you see the after effects in your bathroom, when you actually see that, I think they're just more, they're forced to face the reality of what happened. Whereas if you're just going into an abortion facility and you have this surgery done, you never really see it, So it can take a while to really realize what you did in some ways, or what you were involved in. But when you're right there and you see it in your toilet, I think there's just more of a realization. So right now, over half of abortions in the country are chemical abortions, and that's probably just going to go up. Like, it's just becoming more and more prevalent. So I think in some ways we might see more and more of these stories sooner. Just women who recognize sooner what they did, or feeling guilt for it, feeling regret, that might happen.
I remember seeing soon after Roe was overturned, it might have even been in Facebook, like ads for pills.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There was this real big push, like kind of like, hey, don't worry, we can still get, it's still possible,
Yes.
It's not going away. We're here. And there was a real strong push for that. And you do mention at various times in the book about the European market.
Yeah.
I mean, I know you're focused on America, but how a lot of these pills come from Europe. And which I think you were making the point there that it skews the numbers a bit. Like we don't actually, like I think you mentioned 4.9 million pills at one point in our history of the mifepristone, which in my head was like, well, it's like 5 million dead children.
Yeah.
But that wasn't counting the pills being bought from overseas.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's really, unless, sometimes this group, Aid Access, the one that's the main one in Europe that will send these pills to women in the U.S., sometimes they'll give their numbers to a pro-abortion group, and that pro-abortion group will put out a paper or something saying, this is how many women from these different states have ordered these pills in the last so many months. So we can sometimes see numbers, but they're not reporting to the FDA. Like, they're not regulated by the FDA. In fact, the FDA told them to stop. But of course, this group was actually like, no, we're not going to listen to you. We don't care. We're going to send these pills. But yeah, so it's definitely a skewed reporting at this point. And the thing is, like, the pro-life states right now, where technically abortion is illegal, there are still these pills going into those states through groups like Aid Access overseas, other online pharmacies that are unregulated by the FDA. So it's still going on. There are still abortions in those states.
Okay, so then, forgive my ignorance, then the Dobbs decision, Dobbs or Dobbs?
Dobbs. B. With a B.
Dobbs. Was Dobbs intended only for surgical abortions then?
No. It's just these state laws that don't allow, technically the state laws that don't allow for abortion, they just make it illegal for someone to perform an abortion. And often they say this does not apply to the mother. Like, we will not prosecute mothers for their involvement in an abortion. So, I mean, it is illegal for these other groups to be mailing pills into pro-life states, but for the mother to actually take the pill, there's nothing that's going to tell her she can't do that. It's just the people who are giving the drugs to her. So that is kind of a question and a problem that some groups that oppose abortion have been talking about. And some pro-life groups are approaching it more of like, well, we're going to try to cut off these groups that are sending it from overseas or from other states. But it is a question going forward. And just a reminder that abortions, they were going on before Roe v. Wade. They are going on even in pro-life states after Roe v. Wade. So it is a problem of the heart, and what our culture thinks is good, and how we view solutions to unplanned things that happen in life. And so it's definitely going to be a big question moving forward, how to deal with that, especially in states that have restricted abortion, banned abortion. There are people who promote it as women's health care. They're very adamant about that, and they're very bold about trying to make sure women can have access to these pills.
What would you say is the magnitude of this issue relative to the other things that this world is encountering right now that we might consider humanitarian crises, and why? And the reason I'm asking is because some people make it their life's work. I'm not judging anybody at all on this. I'm just saying, for some people, that they could do this the rest of their life is make that their thing. Whereas others, I think the majority of us, realize it's a horrible thing that's happening in our lifetime. Well, I suppose it's always been around, but we have other things going on in our lives. But if we were to look at world history, for example, from creation till now, where do you place this issue of abortion? And not just in America, but worldwide, as we're seeing it now with the technology of medicine and pharmaceuticals. Specifically, I'm talking about more modern history, right?
Well, I mean, maybe my perception is skewed because this is what my job is, and I'm always and I'm always reading about abortion, seeing what's going on the topic. I think it's core to our culture. I don't know if I could really say, it's more important than any other topic, but I think it's ultimately a gospel issue. Which is why I think it's so important, because it ultimately doesn't stem from, abortion is not the problem. And I talk about this in the book. There's a woman in Florida who runs a pregnancy center there, and she had an abortion when she was a teenager. And when she sees women who are considering abortion, she sees herself in a lot of ways. She recognizes, okay, the problem is not this baby necessarily. It's not the abortion. The problem is this woman thinks that her problem of this unplanned pregnancy is bigger than anything else. It's bigger than God. It's bigger than any solution that would allow her to continue raising this child. And she says that when she got an abortion, in a way, she was pushing God into a corner in her mind. And just saying, no, I'm not going to listen to what God has to say on this issue. I'm just going to get this abortion because I think this is the best way to fix the problem. So she encourages women to think, okay, what does God have to say about this? And in light of that, make your decision. Don't base it on yourself. So I think culturally it is very similar, where it's not just the woman, but the culture around her that's saying, oh, well, you do you do what you think is best. This is the way to fix your problem. Well, we all have problems. Not all of us have had unplanned pregnancies, but we've had other problems. And if we rely on ourselves and our own solutions to fix those, that's not a real solution. We need to turn to God. We need to turn to His Word, recognize that we are all sinners in need of a Savior, and confess our sins to Him and accept Christ's sacrifice on our behalf. So abortion in a way is like a type of all of those things that we all deal with, where we think we are big enough, we're God in this situation, we can fix it. When in reality, we need to follow the Lord. We need to confess our sins to Him. We need to submit our lives to Him. So So I mean, people even around that woman who are encouraging this act of abortion, they do that because they don't submit to God first. People have done this for centuries. Even early church fathers talked about abortion and how they saw it as murder and against God's commands. So it's not a new issue, like you were saying. It's not just since the early 1900s. It's been around way longer. And just like all sins have been around since the garden, and it's the same solution to that. Like all sins have the same solution in Christ. And this one might be a little more, I guess, sensitive in some ways because it involves familial relationships. It involves death, but it's still solved at the cross, just like any other problem.
Yeah.
So
that's the gospel argument.
Yeah.
Let's now move to the practical. Not that the gospel's impractical.
Yeah.
Let's look at it holistically now. So we've talked about the gospel aspect of it, which is all of this.
Mm-hmm.
But there's other things as well. So there's the economic, and each of these could be on an individual and national, global level. So you have the economic, so the personal finances or situation, as was it Anna that we talked about earlier, and which was one of the main things that her boyfriend was saying, like, we can't pay for another child.
Yeah, they already had two. It's too much,
You were young.
Mm-hmm.
There's the familial or communal or whatever you want to call it. So there can be that. There's career, which I think is a bit different than economic.
Sure.
Because it has to do also with personal identity and future of economic gain or status in society. There's ideological, and that can overlap into community because, especially in some communities, why wouldn't you get an abortion?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's all these, I guess I just talked about these things in an individual kind of manner. But on a global scale, I think what's fascinating to me when I think about abortion as a phenomenon is that it's only been in recent history that we've managed in our capacity as innovative human beings to develop ways and means to make abortion not only clinical, I guess that's a really hard, cold way to say it, to make it clinical, which therefore it's accepted as medicine or women's health. So it's clinical, it's scalable, pharmacological, I don't know if that's a proper category, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Versus taking some weird mixture of herbs back in the day that may or may not work and may kill you. Now it's become a science, a practiced, accepted science. So there's that. But then there's also the ideological, to where it's not just accepted but encouraged, hashtag shout your abortion type thing. And not only that, but along with that, we've had other things happening globally, such as technological and geographical, people moving into cities on a mass scale. And what was the other one I was thinking of? Oh, just frankly, the fact that as a population, the world has grown from 1 billion to 2 to 6 to 8, whatever it is now. And so that just means in terms of statistics, there are many, many, many more abortions happening now than there were in the chapters that Marvin wrote. So I guess now, getting back to my question, is when we look at it from within still the gospel lens, I would say, we never take that out of the discussion. But then thinking, okay, what impact is this having on us as a society? And God cares about society too. He's given us brains to think up systems of government, both good and bad, and infrastructure and everything else that encourages human flourishing. But it feels like abortion is the arrow going the other direction, it seems. Or is it? I mean, there are some arguments that would say, well, actually, the world's kind of better off because this isn't my thought at all, but some people might make the argument, and I'm not necessarily thinking of those who think the population of the world should be smaller, but there are many probably might argue, oh, it's actually, there's benefits to this. You know, it's sad, it's tragic, but there's benefits to this. But I guess it's the question I'm posing to you is, even just thinking on your feet, is what impact is abortion having on us as a global, I guess we can call it the global community of humanity? What's it doing to society, to culture, to economics, to nations, all of these things?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because at the same time that we're seeing abortion be so accepted and normal, we're also seeing a lot of countries move toward legalizing euthanasia or assisted suicide. So I think, I don't know, it's partially doing something, but it's also partially showing something about what's already there, which is basically just a devaluation of people who are seen as unproductive or unnecessary. So like, you know, making a value judgment on another human being. So it's a symptom of that's already going on in someone's heart, but it also perpetuates that in some ways, because then it's just normal. Like, oh, well, you know, we euthanize animals that are weak or, you know, dying. Why can't we do that with humans? You know, you're just assuming that it's the same rules when, you know, we're all mammals, right? But in reality, there's something essentially different about humans that people just don't recognize because they don't know scripture. So, and maybe they do know because God has made himself clear in creation. You know, his invisible qualities and divine nature are clearly seen. So maybe they do know and they're just ignoring that. But one way to perpetuate that ignorance is through things like euthanasia and abortion. So I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Well, yeah, but at least to not open.
Okay.
Is this, because I've heard talk around this type of thing before, do you think that this tendency towards almost self-annihilation, not on a corporate sense, not an individual sense,
Sure.
when putting suicide,
Yeah.
is this tendency towards self-annihilation that humanity seems to have as we move towards more acceptance, and actually quite a vigorous push towards these things amongst certain groups who hold that ideology. We could call them the elites or whatever. Is this something that's intrinsic to just being human, or is it demonic influence? Is this Satan's grand plan? Where is this coming from? Why would we do this?
Well, I think we can go all the way back to Genesis. My dad would be very proud of me saying that Genesis 1 through 11 really does have foundational principles for how we see the rest of life and the rest of Scripture. And if you look at Genesis 1 through 3, just the story of Adam and Eve, the true story, I would say, the historical account. But Adam and Eve were told that if they ate of this fruit, they would surely die, you know. But they did. So I guess you can see that tendency towards self-annihilation back in the fall, in the original sin. So, and that's, we all share in their nature, and because of just who we are as fallen humans, we see that same tendency in all of us. So maybe there's a demonic influence, but I think we're capable of also doing it on our own, unfortunately. But yeah, I think that is just a result of the fall and evidence of our need for the gospel.
Wow, I've never heard anyone talk about Genesis 1 like that. I mean, I've never thought about it that way. They chose death. It reminds me of that horrific and yet, I think, necessary to read book. What is it called? Ordinary Men, or something like that. And it's an account of these police battalions in World War II in Nazi Germany. And these were just normal guys. They were just totally normal policemen whose ranks got supplemented by other men who were like a provisionary forces back in Germany while the rest of the army was out fighting on the various fronts. And their job was originally what you would think of police, to just maintain security and whatnot. But gradually over time, they were conditioned to become very skilled executioners, of people that other Germans who happened to be Jewish. And they would go village to village and just take the people up to the woods and do what they were taught to do. And the book is amazing because it shows the transition that these men went through. Some of them went readily to the work. Most of them expressed hesitation, and maybe one or two just flat out wouldn't do it. But they for the most part, they turned into murderers, like mass murderers.
Yeah.
Something was able to reach that switch, if we could call it that. So, but moving on from the gruesomeness of that is something I really want to ask you, that I was thinking about reading through this book, is, so what now? So you're a woman who's had an abortion, and, or maybe multiple, and you know that there's forgiveness, the gospel. Let's assume that isn't that much. And yet still the gravity of what happened hangs over you. Or maybe you're a man who encouraged your partner or your girlfriend or even your wife to get an abortion. What now?
Well, I think there is the Lord's grace even in difficult situations. He can use those things to sanctify you, to reveal your need for Christ, and also to give you an opportunity to help others. So I think that's why we see so many women who have had abortions being very influential in pro-life organizations, like heading up a pregnancy center, or I can think right now, just off the top of my head, the president of this one pro-life group, Americans United for Life, she had an abortion herself. So I'd say don't waste it, like, what you know now, tell it to other people. And there's plenty of ways you can get involved and help other women through that. Obviously, you're not going to be free of the weight of what happened until eternity, but thankfully in eternity, he will wipe away every tear from our eyes. So we can look forward to that. But during our time on earth, we all have different burdens that we carry through life. And the Lord allows us to minister to others because of those burdens. And maybe this is the burden that that he is using in your life to reach others as well.
I have a good friend in Los Angeles, where I'm from, who she did that. She opened Westside Pregnancy Center.
Oh, cool. Cool.
Talitha Phillips, do you know that name?
Oh. It sounds so familiar. Okay, maybe I do know her. Yeah.
I think she's still at the Westside Pregnancy.
Okay, that's cool.
I remember I accompanied her and one of her friends who'd also had an abortion, and then we went to. This was my first foray into documentary filmmaking. I just had a little camcorder. I was like, let me just shadow you guys in film. And we went out to New Orleans for some March for Life or some kind of rally.
Yeah.
And I was just out in university and totally broke. And she got me a po' boy sandwich. So I had no money at all.
Oh, that's sweet.
To pay for
Yeah.
But I just remember her influence in the community, but also the hostility that came about, especially being in a place like Santa Monica, LA. And it was hard. I think it still is hard for her at times. And these other individuals who run these centers. But I wanted to ask you about your own personal experiences. Do you find that I'm sure you've gotten quite a lot of positive feedback, and you will hereafter from the publication of this book and whatnot, and these public appearances, but have you started to feel some of the heat as well?
Yeah, I guess not specifically like in recent months, but I have had some interactions in the past where people, it's a very sensitive subject. And if you feel the weight of maybe what you did, or if you feel tied to like, no, women need this to succeed, I can understand how someone would be angry at someone who writes in books like this, or, just in my reporting. I can understand. Yeah.
So can I ask you a personal question?
Sure.
You've talked about Marvin's influence in your life, and just you love babies and whatnot. But is there something that you personally, like in your family or something, really kind of sparked the fire for you to want to focus on abortion?
Nothing that comes specifically to mind, except that I loved my family, and I love my parents, and I've always loved them. Some people go through a teenage rebellion stage. I didn't fall into that, thankfully. And I think I just recognized how influential my parents were in my life, and how much I just loved being with them and being brought up by them. So I wonder if it's kind of the absence of that I recognize in cases of abortion, like reasons why people would consider abortion or why maybe they did abort. It's the exact opposite. So I wonder if it's kind of just recognizing the importance of family, and how the breakdown of the family is so closely tied with abortion, or abortion is so closely tied with the breakdown of the family. That might have been part of it. So I've always loved families, I guess.
No, I get that. And it so makes me think that your perspective then on the women, and I would say the men too, who are involved in these situations where they have to make this decision, is one of sympathy.
Yeah. Well, and because a lot of the couples who run into these situations themselves did not have good families. Obviously, that's not always the case. Sometimes they did, probably. But just recognizing how it's these generational sins in a way, like how one generation can so intimately affect the next, and then the next, and the next. I think that was a big part for me, just something that I realized as a kid, and how blessed I was to have a family that loves the Lord and raised me in a loving way.
Okay, so that that leads me to another question, which I've been wanting to ask you since the beginning. And the reason why is because I didn't see, you can correct me always if I'm wrong, but if I didn't see much discussion of it, because I know it's not necessarily what you were focused on, but, and I haven't looked these numbers up, but because you're so focused on individual stories, my mind then was going to the question of, well, we live in quite the large country, and this is the story of abortion in America. But are there families, or I would say communities, where abortion is more prevalent? And when I say communities, I mean we can look at it from the standpoint of culture, geographical location, whether rural or metropolitan or wherever. Is it certain areas of the country, certain states, certain demographics? I mean, or is it just, I know this isn't the answer, but because it can't be statistically, or is it just kind of the same across all of it?
Well,
where is abortion happening the most?
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to get to.
I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but there are a disproportionate percentage of Black babies that are aborted. So that's one example that comes to my mind. Oh man, honestly, I'm terrible at numbers, so I'm not gonna try to remember. But considering the percentage of the population in the United States that are Black, the percentage of total abortions in the country are relatively high for the Black population. And I'm sorry I don't have better statistics to share, but I don't want to pull one out of my sleeve.
And I'm not looking for exact numbers. Yeah. I'm more curious to know in general. Because I think unless we know where the problem is manifesting itself the greatest, how in the world could we hope to help?
Yeah.
Right. So if there are more Black babies being killed every year than white or Asian or Hispanic or any other demographic, there's something there. There's something we need to look into. If it was more white babies, whether that's in total number or relative in terms of percentages to the population, I mean, that tells a story too. So this is the big story.
Yeah.
There's the individual stories, but they're connected.
Yeah.
That's why I asked.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think people who oppose laws that would prevent abortions from happening, they'll often say that, this law is going to disproportionately affect like minority communities, people of color. And in a sense, they're spot on in that it is those communities that are often the ones seeking abortions. But I think they just misunderstand, and maybe knowingly, maybe unknowingly, just, what actually is going on in an abortion, and how it doesn't just affect what happens in the abortion, doesn't just affect the mother, it affects the baby. But they do point to things like maternal mortality rates for Black women, which are high, unfortunately. But to say that the solution to that is to kill the babies before they're born seems like a disservice to those women who are giving birth. That's one thing I've recognized, especially in the last several months in my reporting. It just seems like abortion has resulted in poor medical solutions for people who are pregnant, for women, because it's the quick solution. If there's a life-threatening complication in a pregnancy, we'll get an abortion. Instead of let's treat both patients, let's help both of them make it safely. Instead of improving just more maternal safety after birth for Black women, minority communities, let's abort the babies early on. That should not be how we approach these medical issues. And yet that has become an argument. So I think it just has given the medical community an easy way out in some ways from the really hard questions of let's find out how to fix this problem.
Interesting. So do you think that that's keeping the medical community from innovation, from finding new ways to cure certain things that we could have done, that we could be making progress on if we didn't have that quick fix?
This is something I'm currently looking at. So I have been talking with some pro-life OBGYNs about this. But yeah, I think that's my understanding. I mean, obviously I'm not a medical person, but based on some conversations that I've had, say with mothers who faced pregnancy complications, there's this one woman in particular who I've been corresponding with. She was encouraged to get an abortion because she was losing amniotic fluid. They were like, the baby's not going to make it and you might be in danger as well. And at the time she thought, how did I get the worst doctor in the world? And then later she realized, after giving birth to a baby who, almost didn't make it, but she did, because they found another doctor who was willing to help fight for the baby and the mother. After that, she started meeting all these other women who had similar stories. She's like, so I guess I didn't get the worst doctor in the world. I guess this is more common than I thought. So just hearing her story, hearing how, in her understanding, it does seem like this has become the solution for these complicated cases, instead of let's find a new solution that's an actual solution that will value the mother and the child. So I thought that was a compelling story, and I hope to dig into that more in the coming months.
Yeah. I'm not going to apologize for it, but I did hit you with some.
Oh, no, that's fine.
Questions or... Well, I like to do that. I don't want to prep people on them. Just give me up for this,
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I don't like giving people questions beforehand.
All the time, zero reporter.
Yep.
It's like, this is Mapco.
Yeah. Well, and then you just get them more instead of their edited self.
Have you read the book Chaos?
No.
It's the story of the CIA's involvement in the Charles Manson murders.
Okay.
It's crazy. Yeah, and under the whole the LSD program that they were doing and that stuff. But anyway, the reporter who wrote that book, which it took him about 20 years to write it, he whenever he went to meet with the lead prosecutor of Charles Manson in that case, the guy had, there's a prosecutor, he had notebooks full of all things, and he would just read scripted answers.
That's funny.
Yeah. And so it took him like a decade or so to finally get that guy to make a slip.
Okay.
But that slip opened everything. Yeah. But he had to be persistent. Anyway, as a reporter, you might want to read that book.
That sounds interesting.
It's crazy. It's very interesting.
Marvin really likes this book called Work, I think, by Robert Caro or something.
Okay.
I don't remember what it's about. I mean, it's written by, I believe, a reporter. But he says something about asking questions until the person answering is exhausted. Like he's like, you have to do that. You got to keep asking for more details until they're exhausted. So sometimes I want to do that. I try to do that, but I think I'm a softie. So sometimes I back off before that point.
No, it's actually really good advice. In fact, I may edit this part out, but I might not. Is your vibe thing was changed just about 20 minutes ago.
Oh, really?
Where you sat like this most.
Yeah.
You adjusted and you put your elbows on that table and it changed.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
I was like, yeah.
I think my feet were getting cold.
It's a big giant hair. Yeah.
This is how I sit normally, with like one foot up, which is probably not good for my knees. But do you see that? I feel like that hurt. I know.
Yeah, we have an air AC in here, but I don't have a park it.
It's fine. I'm always cold. I'm always cold, especially in the winter.
No, it gets chilly here, which is why I like working out.
Yes.
So, speaking of non-working electricity,
Yeah.
this isn't a very good segue, but the abortion industrial complex.
Oh, yes.
So, I'm glad that you went into this. I mean, you title a chapter that way.
Yeah.
And the reason it's interesting to me is because we're presently facilitating a war in Ukraine. We've had the war in Afghanistan. We're a nation that has a history of war. And some people would place the blame for some of our involvements on the military-industrial complex. What is the abortion industrial complex?
Well, the idea there is that there are groups that make money off of the death of unborn babies. So,
How do they do that? Besides, because sorry to interrupt, but
yeah,
of course there's payment that's made. And that's an area I don't even know much about either, but women pay to get an abortion, or the man pays, but there's payment that's being made for this operation to be done. But what you're saying is the money flow doesn't stop there.
yeah, yeah. And there's been some investigation into this. I don't know if you've heard of David.
The videos.
Yes, the videos.
I saw the videos.
Yes, yeah. So the idea is that there are groups that actually purchase body parts of aborted babies for just different technological, scientific developments. They like to have complete, intact certain parts of the body of the baby. And the pro-life groups that have investigated into this argue that this is not just a donation from Planned Parenthood, that they're making money off of these body parts. So beyond just, an industry making money off of women coming to them and, getting an abortion, they're making more money off of the sale of these dead humans, which is gruesome to think about. And that's why Planned Parenthood went after David Daleiden, who took those videos under cover of, Planned Parenthood executives talking about how they would do the abortions to best preserve certain body parts for sale for the companies that want these products of the aborted babies. But it is also that understanding that fuels some pro-life groups. There's some more progressive pro-life organizations that, they say they're not motivated by any religious views. They're often atheists. They're often very progressive in other social issues like LGBTQ issues, but they see this as an instance of like capitalism and oppression of poorer people to make a profit. And the poorer people in some ways is the women, but also the babies who are so poor. I mean, they literally have nothing. They don't even have their lives. So, that is one of those chapters that Marvin mainly, he was like, hey, we got to have something about this in here, just to point out, because that language of the industrial complex, I think it resonates with a lot of people who maybe otherwise wouldn't really think about abortion as being an instance of this oppression or taking advantage of another population for the sake of making money. But yeah, we wanted to tease that out in the book.
It's truly horrifying. And I say that because when I saw those videos, I was shocked by the audacity, I guess we'd call it, of human beings to exploit the sale of body parts, and to think that there was something else going on. Wow, it was just gruesome, and I think that really overwhelmed my thoughts. But after reading your chapter, it really came foremost in my mind that there's an enormous incentive to keep this going. So it's not just, or even primarily, perhaps, about let's call it like that leftist ideology of a woman's choice to choose death, basically.
Yeah.
There's actually, maybe that then is just kind of the distraction from what's really at heart here, which again is just simply the G word, right? Greed. Because I don't remember the number, but isn't this something that billions of dollars, this industry?
Yeah, I don't remember exact numbers either, but I mean, it's definitely a big industry, and Planned Parenthood itself has a lot of money. and they're just one organization involved in this industry. They're obviously.
Sorry, what about the companies that are buying the parts?
Yeah.
Like, who are they? What are they doing?
Yeah.
With these parts? Like, why has that not been brought to light, or has it?
Well, there's definitely been an attempt to bring this to light, but it's those groups and groups like Planned Parenthood that are trying to silence people who attempt to expose what is going on. So yeah, like talking about David Daleiden and his videos, there are some videos that haven't come out because of the lawsuits against David Daleiden. These groups have tried to take those videos away from him and prevent him from ever sharing them. So, they have lots of power. It's kind of similar to what we see earlier in the book when these abortionists are paying off the police or paying off the just local officials who would otherwise be coming after them for breaking the law. It's kind of a similar, I mean, we don't know for sure, but it seems to be these relationships between politicians and these groups. I mean, Planned Parenthood has a political action committee that gives a lot of money to the campaigns of Democratic candidates. So people like David Daleiden argue that Kamala Harris, who's now our vice president, at the time she was the attorney general in California, and they argue that it's the relationship between her and Planned Parenthood that resulted in a raid at David Daleiden's home where they confiscated his laptops and his videos. So they would look at those relationships and argue that that's a big part of where the power of the abortion industrial complex comes from, is from those politicians who are funded by pro-abortion organizations that want to keep the business going. And they recognize one of the best ways to make that happen is to have people in positions of power who will ensure that abortion is still accessible and legal.
If it is an industrial complex, and I'm trying to draw parallels here between the military industrial complex and the abortion industrial complex, are we seeing research and development and other types of technological innovation that we see in the military, like weaponry, for example? Are we seeing that with abortion, with pills, with procedures, and so forth? Or are you happy to let it be the way it is?
Well, we've certainly seen a lot of improvement, quote unquote improvement, in the people who are providing abortions over the years. Like before, there was an understanding of how to ensure that you're doing an antiseptic procedure. There were a lot more deaths for women who were getting the abortions, not just the death of the baby, but the women too. And also then once we had like antibiotics, that would help prevent infections or get rid of infections if women had some sort of complication from an abortion. I mean, there are still women who die from getting abortions. There are records of that, but it's just less common than it used to be. So I wonder if in some ways we've already gone through that stage of improving abortion to make it more safe, quote unquote, for the women. But abortion pills certainly are probably the latest step in that. But in a way, it's also taking abortion out of a clinical setting and making it something that women can do autonomously in their home. So it's not even medical anymore, you know. It's personal, which is what they argue. Like, it used to be a decision between a woman and her doctor. Now it's just a decision between a woman, you know. And who knows who else is influencing her in that decision, but certainly doctors don't, because in that case, you just go into an abortion facility, pick up the pills, or you order it online. There's no one really monitoring you. They recommend you go to an emergency room. If you have complications, that's actually what pro-abortion groups recommend. If women who have taken chemical abortion pills, if they have problems, go to the emergency room, and you don't have to tell them that you had an abortion. You can just say you're miscarrying.
Yeah, you said about half are mislabeled as miscarriage.
Yeah, there are some studies looking at the medical records, through Medicaid reports. So in the states that do fund abortions, you can see these records, and they've found, just in looking closely at them, there are certain cases that were labeled miscarriages, but they also saw that within a certain time period before that case of a miscarriage showing up in an emergency room, those same women were getting abortion pills. So they recognized, well, there's no way she could have a miscarriage within that short amount of time after getting this abortion pill. It must have been a complication from the abortion pill, which is why she's in the emergency room. And it's not always, based on just talking with the people who did that study, it's not always specifically related to the abortion why she's in the emergency room. Maybe it was another issue, but there are these especially when it's listed as a miscarriage, certainly that would be the reason why she went in. But there are still a lot of women going into emergency rooms who have had abortions, and it seems to be a higher rate than you would really expect. But it shows that there is a tie there between these negative outcomes and that abortion in the first place. So, yeah.
Wow. It's sad.
Yeah.
It's really sad.
It is so sad. Yeah.
It's maybe a dark thought, but perhaps the proliferation of the pills is cutting into the profits of the industrial complex, at least the part that sells the body parts.
Yeah, you'd wonder about that.
Developed enough yet.
Yeah.
So maybe that will cause some infighting that helps this whole thing crumble.
Yeah, maybe. That would be a blessing. Yeah, sad, but still. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so let's wrap things up with a question that comes on the heels of the way you close out your final chapter. And it's a simple question. So you talked about the Beavers family.
Oh yeah, Barbara Beavers, yes. Mm-hmm.
So before I ask the question, just give us a quick synopsis of that of the Beavers.
Yeah, so they're in Mississippi, and I believe it was Barbara's husband, Mr. Beavers, first, who started going outside of abortion facilities in Jackson to pray for people who had come for abortions. And she was telling me, I talked to her right around the time that the last abortion facility, the Pink House, closed in Jackson. And she was telling me about how they have this history of praying outside of abortion facilities, and how, finally this is the last one that's closing. And it's just a dream come true for them, because they've seen one after the other close, but then this Pink House, women, especially, since I don't know if you're familiar with the law in Texas that took effect before Dobbs, the heartbeat law.
The Lubbock, and I've heard the name of it. Yeah,
so there was an ordinance in Lubbock, but then the state of Texas, the Texas heartbeat law, SB 8, went into effect in September 2021. And people at the Pink House in Jackson would tell me how they would see a lot more out-of-state license plates starting around that time. Not necessarily just women from Texas, but women from other surrounding states, maybe because more women from Texas were coming to other states to get abortions, and then women from those other states were coming to Mississippi because they were booked in their state. So there was a massive influx of out-of-state patients and out-of-state abortions. But then we finally see this Dobbs decision. Within a couple weeks, the Mississippi law banning abortion took effect, and that resulted in the closure of that last abortion facility. And she was just so excited to finally see that day. So I think it was fitting to close with that, just because it showed, how long people in a lot of these states have been working to see that day come in their state. And a lot of them have seen it, but like we've been talking about, there are still abortions going on, unfortunately, just not at those buildings.
Yeah. Let me read that final paragraph, because that'll then lead to my question.
Oh, okay.
Because then I was going to ask, well, how long were they praying? But you actually say it right here. Because it's a testament to the Lord's power, but he listens to our prayers, even though it can take a long time. Because it says, or you say here, back in the 1980s, when Beaver's husband first started praying on abortion facility sidewalks, the state had about a dozen abortion facilities. So they watched the last one close. She said she and her husband used to pray outside 4 others that were once operating in Jackson. And then, quoting her, and you say, where you quote her, where she said, "We've seen them close one by one over the years," said Beavers. "This was the last one. So it is a dream fulfilled." So my question to you, Leah, is what is your dream in regarding abortion? And asking you that, I know that you've told us earlier that you and Mara are a bit on the pessimistic side. You would not have anticipated at all, even when you knew Dobbs was starting to, well, it was in progress, yeah. And you thought, no, there's no way Roe's going to go overturned. But what was that? 40 years of prayer, and they saw all the abortion clinics close in their state. And that was the Beavers' dream fulfilled. What is your dream? Knowing the reality of human sin and the stories of abortion in America, but without going all the way to the second coming. That's the easy answer. Yeah. Everything's perfect now. But what is your dream? Let's say your lifetime. A lifetime of reporting by Leah Savas. What would be your dream fulfilled?
For the abortion issue specifically? Well, okay, so the first thing that comes to my mind is there is this woman I spoke with once who had just recently told her family that she had an abortion, I think as maybe a 30-year-old, and she's a grandma by now, by the time I talked to her. And she said that for years she had been in Bible studies. She got an abortion before she became a Christian. At the time, it didn't bother her, but then once she became a Christian, it started to really weigh on her because I think she recognized what she had done. But for some reason, she thought that this abortion was the unforgivable sin, that for some reason Christ's sacrifice on the cross couldn't pay for that one, even though it could cover her other sins. So she went through this Bible study where she finally realized that no, like she has been forgiven for that as well. And And then, she told her family and told a reporter. She told me, I was like, I can't believe you're telling me. This is great. Thank you so much for sharing your story with me. So I think that's my desire for women who have had abortions, and I guess just for our culture in general, to not see abortion as like, oh, this is the unforgivable sin, so we're not going to let it be considered a sin. It's okay. I want people to recognize, like, sure, there are certain things about it that are way different than a lot of other sins, but that doesn't mean that Christ, in dying on the cross for sins, plural, cannot take the punishment for that. So I think that's my desire, to see more women recognize that. And I don't know if necessarily in this book, I mean, we do talk about that in the chapter with John Piper's story. He emphasizes that, like, the most important thing, I think this is a sermon he gave. He talked about how the most important thing that you could do today is not become pro-life, but to recognize that Christ died for sins and to accept his sacrifice. So I think in some ways I included that in the book because that's one of the top messages I want people to take away. Obviously, on top of that, we have the history of abortion. We just want people to understand that it's not in our tradition to see abortion as acceptable. It's in our tradition to see it as the taking of a human life. So I think, but primarily it was Doris. Her name was Doris. Her story comes to mind. I want to hear that from more people.
That's a good dream.
Thanks.
Yeah, that Christ would be glorified in individual people's lives as they turn to him.
Yeah.
No matter what they've done. Yeah. And we do hope, too, that abortion is eradicated.
Yeah.
As maybe as unrealistic as that might seem. But anyway, thank you so much for coming to talk with me here in our RHB studio. People can get your book from Crossway, your and Marvin's. We have it here at RHB. People can get it elsewhere, online or in our bookstore. But tell us where else we can find you. Twitter, or your online.
I'm on Twitter. I don't tweet much, but if you want to follow me, it's at Leah Savas. I also do a weekly email newsletter for World Magazine or World News Group. And you can subscribe to that at our website. If you go to wng.org and then scroll down to the bottom, there's a little link to newsletters, and then sign up for Vitals. That's mine, and it goes out on Tuesdays.
Okay. We'll put a link in the description.
Awesome.
Yeah. Well, thanks for this, and I hope you come back soon. I know you're local.
Yes.
And we'll talk more. We don't have to wait till you put out another book. So we'll have it back again soon, and thanks everyone for listening.